ready to alienate or hate your family, and prepare to take up your cross. After some ice cream to celebrate, we will break into small groups to consider the cost of being a follower of Jesus. Is it something we really want to do? Oh, and be sure to invite your friends, because this is going to be really hard. And who wouldn't want to be part of a community that at the end of the morning will pass around a form where we promise, each of us, to give away all of our possessions? Yes, all are welcome, but none will be coddled. Would you have come? I might have come just because it sounds crazy enough to be interesting. Thankfully, these words of Jesus are placed within the larger context of the gospel stories. As I told the kids, the Bible is primarily a book of promise. Jesus is both a truth-telling agitator and a healing comforter. And maybe we need both. In the last several weeks, there have been challenging words from Jesus, according to Luke. If you've been away for some of this, you are fortunate, because it begins to take its toll, to feel overwhelming, all this judgment. Speaking of judgment, in 1976, when I was 15 years old, I went to my first ever family reunion. I didn't have any first cousins on that side of the family, so it was a really big deal and a lot of fun. My grandpa was one of 5 boys in his family, and they and most of their kids and grandkids were all at this family reunion. Half the family was from the West Coast, which made it really interesting because I hadn't met any of these people, and half were from the Midwest. I got to know a bunch of my relatives that I had only heard about. One of my great uncles, he was the oldest, and my grandpa was the youngest, was a retired pastor. I later learned that he had a reputation as a revival-style preacher. In the late 30s and early 40s, while he was a pastor in Minneapolis at St. Paul's Lutheran Church, which has now left the ELCA up on Portland Avenue, during that time, he would travel around western Minnesota for special church events. A family friend of ours was at a funeral service a few years ago, and in the bulletin of that funeral service, and I'm not kidding you, it said that the woman who died had been saved by the preaching of H.O. Egerton. Well, wow. I thought we were saved by God's grace. But that's an aside. Back to the reading. On the last day, we had a family worship service out on the Homestead farm near Wallingford, Iowa. There were many preachers in the Egerton family, but it was the eldest brother who was given the pulpit that day. Now, my dad, the pastor himself, but an in-law or outlaw, was less than enthusiastic when he heard that H.O. would be preaching. He was the person that told my grandma, when she was 16 and her father died, that her father was going to hell because he was a Mason on the day of the funeral. Really lovely, lovely. Ironically, though, I gotta get this in there so you don't think this is going to be a total train wreck. Ironically, Uncle H.O.'s son, my mom's first cousin, was also a pastor and theologian, Paul Egerton. Now, Paul was one of the early leaders in the movement to welcome LGBTQ people into full participation in the ELCA about 15 years ago. And about 15 years ago, he was, long before that, he was started doing this work. But about 15 years ago, he was forced to resign when, as a bishop, he presided at the ordination of Pastor Anita Hill. Many of you know her. So things did kind of move forward a bit in that family. So, okay, back to the reunion again. When it came time for the sermon, remember this was 1976, my uncle chose to preach a sermon that drew upon the harsher words of judgment of Jesus. Maybe it was even this text from Luke. He apparently thought it would be prudent to scare some of his wayward relatives back into the true faith through his fire and brimstone preaching. To this day, there is a strong memory of that event in the family. If anything, the message backfired for some of the younger family members. If this is what I'm going to hear on Sunday morning, I don't want any part of it. Not a surprise for us all these years later that these scare tactics didn't work on any of my relatives. If it ever did motivate people, it doesn't now, at least in our circles. We never lead with the judgy Jesus. If any of you have had the misfortune of getting cornered by me, and I have gotten to talk about my understanding of mission, you will have heard this before. So this would be the time to nod. I didn't come up with this, but I'm very interested in it. Back in the day, congregations would talk about the very missions that they supported. A mission here, a mission there, the missions we support in our community, and the global missions we support. Some years ago, I had a conversation with Philip Knudsen, an ELCA missionary in South Africa. I've been with him in South Africa on a couple trips. Philip made this distinction. Missions is something we do to people and for people, and at its worst, it keeps people in their place, or it turns people into people like us. Mission, on the other hand, is about accompanying, walking with. It is meeting God in the other, no matter who the other might be. Mission is about all of life. The thing about mission as opposed to missions is that it recognizes that God, the Holy Spirit, is already present before we do anything. It's not our mission, it's God's mission. And God's mission is always bigger than we can imagine. Another way to look at this is in terms of how we as Calvary perceive our relationship with the world. Let's talk about the neighborhood for now. I've mentioned this before. Alan Roxborough makes a distinction between the missional imagination and the attractional imagination. With the attractional imagination, we seek to make ourselves, well, attractive, so that people will come and be with us. We work to be welcoming, to have good branding and signage, which we do, at least the signage. To have appealing worship and good programs, also that people will be attracted to us and come to us. These things are important, and we should take them seriously and do all of them. But there is something that keeps in check this attractional imagination, and that is the missional imagination. The missional imagination is what moves us beyond ourselves into the world. Not so that we can convert the world or bring the world in or make the world like us, but so that we can, by listening, come to understand how God is already at work in the world. Remember, it's God's mission and it's bigger than we can imagine. So before we do something in the neighborhood, we need to find out what is already happening around us. This is where we have been placed, in this neighborhood. How is God at work around us? And then how might we partner with what is happening, and how we might contribute to what brings life and good news. This loops us back to the hard words of Jesus in Luke. The gospel is a promise of God's free gift of grace. We lead with this in all that we do. All are welcome. but we don't stay there. We have to distinguish between a low-cost, false impression of what it means to be a faith community and the kind of frightening words that Jesus uses in the gospel. There has to be something in between there where all are welcomed and yet all will not be coddled. The decision of who is in and who is out has already been established for us. All are welcome. Through the death and resurrection of Jesus, we are let off the hook. The cost is no longer ours. But when we go out from here, we become vulnerable to the kind of things that Jesus talks about. When we listen, we cannot help but hear the cries of those who suffer. And then we cannot help but take a stand. And sometimes, often, there is a cost to stepping into the arena. We may even find ourselves at odds with family members and close friends, though hate seems a bit strong. I think Jesus, here in this text, wants us to be intentional about our lives. To recognize that who we follow and what we do matters. And though it's centered on love and grace, sometimes it will be as hard as Jesus says. Being the world makes us vulnerable. That's something Calvary knows about these days. The people of Calvary took a risk when we started the Urban Arts Academy 18 years ago. But it was worth it, wasn't it? Amen. Even if it wasn't able to continue in perpetuity, there were so many good things that came from it. It made a difference in people's lives. We can give thanks not only for the people that were impacted by the Urban Arts Academy, but also for all the blood, sweat, and tears that went into it over these many years, including the last many weeks. At the same time, and this is something interesting about the Christian faith, that we often do these things at the same time. We grieve and look ahead at the same time. At the same time, we can be excited for what the coming months will bring for Calvary. As we look to the future, and as we wonder together about what new ways God is calling us to serve, to partner, listen, and do justice in this neighborhood and beyond. My friends, it will be hard sometimes, but it will be worth it. Amen.